Hi, Elaine here from markergeek.com. Today I thought I'd do a little voiceover for this video. I decided to play with my Copic markers and Kraft paper rather than colouring on my usual white paper. This isn't actually strictly Kraft, this is Strathmore toned tan paper, which worked fairly well actually. I was quite surprised that it worked so well with the markers. I thought it might be a little bit thin, but it stood up quite nicely with the alcohol ink. It has actually been quite a while since I used markers on Kraft paper or toned tan. I use it with pencils quite a lot. I like colouring with pencils on the Strathmore toned tan or on Kraft cardstock, and you'll be seeing some more of that later this week. I will have a video showing me colouring this very image but using Prismacolor pencils. For comparison, I made identical cards because I'm a little bit lazy when it comes to the card making side of things, but it's quite interesting to see the differences in the pencils on the toned tan, and also to note the difference in colouring with different mediums on this paper. Colouring with the pencils I find a little bit easier, but I will talk more about that in that video. Colouring with the Copic markers on toned tan was not terribly difficult. It does take a little bit of adjusting because when you're colouring on this paper or on Kraft cardstock, because the ink is wet, it will appear much darker on this cardstock, on this paper, than it does on the white. You usually get the effect of it sort of drying back slightly lighter on white paper, but it's usually not hugely noticeable, and you usually get a better idea of what the colours are coming out like. As you can see here, as I am colouring the chicks, the colours do appear much darker while the ink is wet. So until you get used to how this works, and what you're laying down on the paper, the amount of ink you're laying down on the paper, it kind of makes you a little bit more hesitant. You need to wait for things to kind of dry a little bit before you carry on, which is more noticeable probably when you're colouring small things, small areas on a stamped image like these chicks, because obviously by the time you've finished sort of laying down ink, it doesn't have time to dry before you want to go in with the next colour, or you want to see if you want to layer more colour down. On the pig, it was kind of easier, but once I'd kind of got a feel for it, it wasn't too bad. It's just one of those things that you need to adjust to when working on a different paper, specifically one that is darker, because that ink, when it's wet, will appear differently. It will appear much darker. Overall, as when using coloured pencils, I'm really happy with how the colours turned out. I really love colouring on this toned paper. There's just something about it. It sort of adds to the richness of the colours. I just really love the effect. On this occasion, I just used the Copic markers. I didn't want to add any additional mediums. When colouring again, I would probably add in some pencil, specifically some white pencil, to add in some soft highlights, just to increase the contrast between the image and the paper. And that would come into play more so on the pig. I think when I finish colouring the pig, you'll kind of see I could really have done with adding in some highlights, but I wouldn't want it to be quite as stark as maybe a gel pen or some Copic white paint. I'd really want the softness of the white pencil. If revisiting this image, I would probably also choose slightly different colours for the pig. I might go for a slightly different base sort of shadow layer, or maybe just adjust how much of it I used I'm not unhappy with it, but it could just be tweaked a little bit, I think. But this was a bit of an experiment, and I'm not unhappy with how it turned out. I think it turned out pretty well. I would use the Tone Tan again with Copic Markers. It probably wouldn't hold up to a massive amount of layering, although it wasn't bad. I did a fair amount of layering, probably nearly as much as I would normally do on my Make It Colour blending card. Maybe not quite as much, but I certainly didn't notice any issues with it, and I didn't really have any problems with the ink sort of feathering outside the lines, etc. So it held up pretty well. I know that for people who like to use Nina paper, there is a Kraft variation of that, which I think is called Desert Storm. I'm not personally a big fan of the Nina Classic Crest paper. I don't really love the way Copics behave on it, so it's definitely not one of my favourites, but if you do enjoy it, then the Desert Storm colour might be worth checking out for doing some Copic colouring on Kraft. I will be exploring some other options that I have in my stash in future just to test out, and I will definitely report my findings over on my blog. The stamp that I have been using is a Stamping Bella stamp called Nice to See You Petunia. The link for the stamp and other products used will be over on my blog, and the link for my blog post will be in the description below here on YouTube. I've been getting a few questions recently about products that I use and what I've done in videos. I always put the information in my blog post, and there is always a link in the description here on YouTube. So always check that out, and it will save you some time and you will get the answers a lot quicker. You will notice towards the end of this video that colouring the glasses that the little chicks are wearing, I opted to use a fine liner or a set of fine liners rather than trying to get into those really teeny tiny spaces with Copics. Normally I actually do, or in the past I have actually used the very tip of the brush nib to get into those tiny spaces. But using the Tone Tan paper, I didn't really want to risk it bleeding outside of those lines because it is such a tiny space, and I wasn't quite sure if the paper was going to behave nicely. So I opted for the safe choice and went with the fine liners. They work really well and they are Copic safe. So you can kind of combine them with your Copic colouring, even if you're going to go back in and colour with Copics around that area. Again, they will be linked in the blog post. And that's it. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you as always for your support. If you enjoyed this video, please do like, share it, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And I will be back later in the week with my Prismacolor pencil version of this image.